$80,000 in debt, a plummeting barometer, and a 1982 John Deere choking on its own rust. Wyatt Henderson had 3 days to bring in the wheat, or he'd lose the family's 320-acre legacy forever. But the real danger wasn't the weather, it was a sealed manila envelope. The air inside the Kearney County farmhouse smelled of stale percolator coffee and decades of unspoken resentments. At the head of the oak kitchen table sat Arthur Henderson, 78 years old, his hands looking like they had been carved from the very Nebraska topsoil he'd spent his life turning. Opposite him was his grandson, Wyatt. Between them sat Thomas Gable, a local property attorney whose tailored grey suit looked entirely out of place against the faded floral wallpaper of the Henderson homestead. Pinnacle Ag Group offered $3.2 million for the North Quarter. Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the hum of the refrigerator. They're bringing the contracts by Friday. Wyatt felt the blood drain from his face. The North Quarter wasn't just land, it was the heart of the Henderson operation. It was 320 acres of the richest, deepest loam in the county. It was also the exact plot of land where Wyatt's father had suffered a fatal heart attack 5 years ago while pulling a calf in a freezing spring rain. "You can't sell it, Grandpa," Wyatt said, leaning forward, his knuckles white against the wood. "Dad gave his life for that dirt. I've been working it for you practically for free for 3 years. You promised me that when you retired, I'd have first right to take over the lease." "I promised you a chance," Arthur corrected coldly, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. "A chance to prove you weren't going to run this farm into the ground the way your generation does everything else. You kids with your GPS-guided tractors, your debt-financed air seeders, your climate-controlled cabs. You farm with iPads, Wyatt. You don't know the dirt. You don't know what it costs when the bank calls your note." "I'm keeping us competitive," Wyatt shot back, his voice rising. "You can't farm in the modern era using tools from the Carter administration. We have to scale to survive." Arthur set his mug down with a heavy thud. He looked at Thomas Gable, then back at Wyatt. His pale blue eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "Competitive, that's a nice corporate word. Let me tell you about competitive, boy. You leased that $250,000 combine last fall, missed a payment in February, and nearly cost us the home place in collateral. You're soft. You rely on warranties and dealership mechanics. If things break, you freeze." Wyatt swallowed hard. The lease payment had been a mistake, a miscalculation on soybean futures, but he had made it right by selling his own truck. Still, Arthur never forgot a debt, and he never forgave a misstep. "I can bring in the winter wheat," Wyatt said, lowering his voice, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "It's a bumper crop this year. The heads are heavy, the moisture is perfect. If I harvest the North Quarter and sell the grain, I can buy the deed from you outright. At fair market value. Just give me 2 weeks. Arthur stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the single-pane windows. "I'll give you a week," Arthur finally said. Wyatt exhaled. "Thank you. I'll call the dealership, see if I can get a loaner harvester." "No," Arthur interrupted, holding up a gnarled finger. "You don't get it. You want to prove you're a Henderson. You want to prove you can bleed for this land like your father did. You're going to harvest those 320 acres, but you aren't using a dealership loaner, and you aren't hiring a custom-cutting crew." Arthur pointed out the kitchen window toward the collapsing corrugated steel pole barn at the edge of the property line. The structure was half swallowed by overgrown bindweed and rusted-out salvage vehicles. "You're going to use the Titan," Arthur said. Wyatt stared at his grandfather as if the old man had just slipped into dementia. The Titan Grandpa that 1982, John Deere, 772. Oh, hasn't been turned over since I was in middle school. It's a scrap heap. The engine is probably seized, the belts are rotted to dust, and the tires are dry rotted down to the rims. Then you better get to wrenching, Arthur said evenly. Thomas Gable cleared his throat, opening his leather briefcase. He pulled out a single manila envelope. The flap was sealed with a heavy layer of packing tape, and Arthur's sprawling signature was written across the seal in black permanent marker. This is a binding legal wager. Wyatt Wow. Gable explained his tone, apologetic but professional. Your grandfather has drawn up a contract. If you can successfully harvest the entire North Quarter, all 320 acres, using only the 1982 combine, and deliver the grain to the county elevator, before the first freeze, the deed to the land transfers to you. Free and clear. Wyatt's heart hammered against his ribs. And if I fail, if the machine breaks down and you can't fix it, or if the weather takes the crop before you finish, Gable said, looking down at his notes, you agree to sign a quitclaim on your remaining legal interest in the family estate. The land goes to Pinnacle Ag Group, and you walk away with nothing. You want me gone, Wyatt whispered, looking at his grandfather in disbelief. You actually want me to lose? Arthur didn't flinch. He reached across the table and tapped the sealed manila envelope. Inside this envelope is a letter. I gave it to Thomas this morning. He will hold it in his firm's safe. You don't get to read it until the harvest is over, whether you win or lose. That letter contains the real reason we are sitting here today. It contains the truth about your father, about this farm, and about why I'm making you do this. What truth? Wyatt demanded, a sudden cold knot forming in his stomach. Dad died of a heart attack. What else is there? Sign the paper, Wyatt Arthur said, leaning back in his chair. Or pack your bags. The choice is yours. Wyatt looked at the envelope, thick and mysterious, sitting next to the contract. He thought about the North Quarter. He thought about the dark, rich soil that held his father's sweat and perhaps his grandfather's darkest secrets. He picked up the pen. I'll need money for parts, Wyatt said, his voice trembling slightly as he signed his name on the dotted line. You have a budget of $500, Arthur said. Out of your own pocket. If I see a mechanic truck pull into that driveway, the bet is off. Thomas Gable took the signed contract, gathered the sealed envelope, and placed them carefully back into his briefcase. The metallic click of the latches sounded like a cell door locking. Good luck, son, Gable said softly. Arthur simply stood up, put his cowboy hat on, and walked out the back door without another word. The bet was on. The smell inside the pole barn was a suffocating mix of diesel sludge, feral cat urine, and 50 years of accumulated dust. Wyatt stood in front of the John Deere 772, Titan II, shining an LED flashlight over its hulking green frame. It looked like a dinosaur skeleton left to rot in a cave. The paint was faded to a sickly, chalky green. The cab glass was coated in a thick layer of grime, and a massive rat's nest was spilling out of the grain tank auger. He's finally lost his mind, a voice echoed from the barn entrance. Wyatt turned to see Cody Miller, his childhood friend and the best diesel mechanic in Kearney County, stepping into the gloom. Cody wiped oil off his hands with a red rag, staring up at the relic. I can't hire you, Cody, Wyatt said, exhausted, before he'd even picked up a wrench. It violates the contract. If Arthur sees you turning a bolt, I lose the land. I know, Cody said, walking up and kicking the massive front drive tire. A cloud of red dust puffed into the air. Thomas Gable drinks at the Rusty Spur. The whole town knows about the bet, Wyatt. People are already putting money down. Mostly against you. I ain't here to turn wrenches. I'm just here to drink a beer and talk to myself. If you happen to overhear my mechanical musings, well, that's just a coincidence." Wyatt cracked a weary smile. "Where do I even start?" "If I were a betting man," Cody said, popping the tab on a can of Coors and leaning against a wooden beam, "I'd say the fuel system is completely varnished. The belts are brittle as potato chips, and the concaves are probably rusted solid. You got $500. You can't buy new belts for that. You're going to have to scavenge." For the next 72 hours, Wyatt didn't sleep. He lived on black coffee adrenaline and sheer stubborn rage. He drained 30 gallons of foul black sludge from the fuel tank, replacing it with fresh diesel. He spent 10 hours crawling through the county junkyard, pulling belts off wrecked industrial washing machines and old conveyors, praying the tension ratings would hold on a combine. His knuckles were perpetually bleeding. Every time he broke a rusted bolt, it took an hour of heating with an oxyacetylene torch and pounding with a sledgehammer to get it free. Through it all, the presence of that sealed envelope haunted him. What didn't he know about his father? What was Arthur hiding? Was this a punishment or a twisted lesson? On the morning of the 4th day, the sky over Nebraska turned the color of a bruised plum. The local radio station was squawking about an unseasonal cold front pulling moisture up from the Gulf. A massive storm, high winds, heavy rain, and plummeting temperatures was 48 hours away. If the wheat got wet, the stalks would break, the grain would rot, and the harvest would be lost. Wyatt sat in the cracked vinyl seat of the Titan's cab. The air conditioning was dead. The radio was dead. The cab smelled intensely of mouse droppings. "All right, you old bastard," Wyatt muttered, turning the key. The starter whined, it groaned, it clicked. Nothing. Wyatt slammed his fist against the steering wheel. "Come on." He climbed out, checked the battery terminals, tightened a ground wire that looked frayed, and climbed back in. He pumped the throttle, sent up a silent prayer to his late father, and turned the key again. The inline-6 turbocharged engine caught. It choked, blew a massive plume of thick black smoke that rattled the corrugated roof of the barn, and then settled into a deafening, rhythmic, metallic roar. The machine was alive. Wyatt engaged the separator clutch. A terrifying screeching echoed through the barn as 30-year-old belts bit into rusted pulleys, but they held. The massive threshing cylinder began to spin, vibrating the entire machine. He drove the beast out into the blinding afternoon sun, the massive 20-foot header attached to the front. He looked toward the farmhouse. Arthur was standing on the porch, leaning on his cane, watching. The old man's face was unreadable. Wyatt steered the combine toward the north quarter. The golden wheat stretched out like a boundless ocean swaying in the rising wind. He lowered the header, engaged the cutting sickle, and pushed the hydrostatic drive lever forward. The machine bit into the crop. The sound was a violent symphony of snapping stalks, grinding metal and rushing grain. Wyatt looked back through the dirty glass window behind his head. A steady stream of hard amber winter wheat was pouring off the auger into the grain tank. It was working. By midnight, Wyatt had cut 80 acres. The halogen work lights on the cab flickered, casting eerie long shadows across the stubble. The cab was sweltering the dust so thick he could taste it in the back of his throat. Every clank, every shudder of the machine sent a spike of panic through his chest. At 3 a.m., the disaster struck. Wyatt was pushing through a heavy patch of wheat when a sound like a shotgun blast ripped through the night air. The combine violently lurched. A horrific grinding noise erupted from the belly of the beast, followed by the sickening smell of burning rubber. Wyatt slammed the emergency stop, cutting the engine. Silence rushed back into the cab, broken only by the whistling wind and the ticking of hot metal. He grabbed his flashlight and scrambled down the ladder. Plunging his head into the side access panel, he saw the carnage. The main primary countershaft belt, the massive lifeline that drove the entire threshing system, had snapped. But worse, the drive pulley itself had sheared completely off its mounting hub. Wyatt dropped to his knees in the dirt. He was done. You couldn't fix a sheared cast-iron hub with $500 in scavenged parts. It was over. Arthur had won. Tears of exhaustion and frustration stung his eyes. He leaned against the warm tire, ready to give up. But as his flashlight beam swept across the broken pulley on the ground, something caught his eye. He picked up the heavy metal disc, burning his fingers on the hot steel. There, stamped into the back of the hub, were initials etched with a welding torch. D.H. 1998. Wyatt traced the letters with a greasy thumb. Dale Henderson, his father. Wyatt frowned, wiping more grease away. Next to the initials was a jagged, ugly weld bead. The pulley hadn't sheared because it was old. It had sheared because it had broken exactly like this 28 years ago, and his father had welded it back together instead of buying a new one. Wyatt remembered a story his dad used to tell him, a story about a harvest in '98 where they nearly went bankrupt, and how Dale had to MacGyver the combine in the middle of a thunderstorm using nothing but a portable welder and a piece of rebar. Wyatt scrambled back up to the cab and dug behind the seat. In a rusted metal toolbox, he found it. The old heavy-duty clamps and the jagged piece of structural steel his father must have left in there decades ago. He looked toward the horizon. Lightning was flashing in the distance. The storm was coming faster than predicted. He didn't have a portable welder, but he had 3 heavy-duty C-clamps, a scavenged industrial tension bolt from the junkyard, and a desperate, terrifying idea. "You aren't dead yet," Wyatt whispered to the machine. He slid under the steel underbelly, the wind beginning to whip the dust into a frenzy, and went to work on a ghost's repair. The wind howled across the Kearney County plains, carrying the sharp metallic scent of ozone and impending rain. Under the belly of the paralyzed John Deere Titan, 2 Wyatt Henderson was fighting a losing battle against time physics and 30 years of rust. His flashlight flickered its dying batteries, casting erratic shadows across the sheared cast-iron hub. The temperature was dropping fast, his breath now forming small white clouds in the oppressive darkness beneath the chassis. He had 45 minutes before the storm broke. Wyatt positioned the jagged structural steel his father had left in the toolbox all those years ago, aligning it over the fracture point of the drive pulley. His fingers slick with grease, and blood from skinned knuckles fumbled with the first heavy-duty C-clamp. He tightened it down, the metal groaning in protest. He needed torque more than his exhausted arms could provide. Grabbing a 2-foot breaker bar, he wedged it over the handle of the clamp and threw his entire body weight into it. Crack! The clamp bit into the steel, locking the fractured hub together with a violent finality. He applied the 2nd and 3rd clamps' alternating sides to balance the immense rotational load the pulley would soon face. Finally, he threaded the scavenged industrial tension bolt from the junkyard washing machine through the center, tightening it until the veins in his neck threatened to burst. It was a monstrosity, an ugly, unbalanced, desperate fix that defied every law of mechanical engineering, but it had his father's stubborn spirit forged into every rigged angle. Wyatt slid out from under the combine, the first heavy drop of rain striking him squarely on the cheek. He scrambled up the ladder, his boots slipping on the metal rungs. He threw himself into the cracked vinyl seat and turned the key. The inline-6 engine roared to life. Wyatt's hand hovered over the separator clutch. If this didn't work, the unbalanced pulley would vibrate the machine apart, sending high-tension belts and shrapnel flying in every direction. He closed his eyes and slammed the clutch forward. The Titan II shuddered violently, A terrifying rattling sound echoed beneath the floorboards, a rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the heavy clamps spinning at high velocity. But the belts caught, the massive threshing cylinder whined to life, and the header auger began to rotate. The ghost fix was holding. "Let's ride, Dad," Wyatt whispered. He pushed the hydrostatic lever forward, plunging the machine back into the ocean of amber wheat. The storm was now fully upon him. Lightning spiderwebbed across the black sky, illuminating the rolling Nebraska plains in stark, terrifying flashes of violet light. For the next 6 hours it was a blurred montage of adrenaline and desperation. The rain began as a light drizzle making the wheat stalks slick and heavy. The old John Deere groaned its engine temperature gauge, hovering dangerously near the red line as it forced the damp crop through the threshing concaves. Wyatt operated on pure instinct. Every time the machine bogged down, threatening to choke on a wet slug of wheat, he feathered the controls, backing off just enough to let it clear before surging forward. The timeline became a ticking bomb. 5 a.m. 40 acres left. The rain intensifies to a steady downpour. The drive tires begin to lose traction, slipping in the softening mud. 7:30 a.m. 15 acres left. The grain tank is full. Cody Miller suddenly appears in the headlights, driving the farm's battered tandem axle grain truck through the muck, violating Arthur's rule against mechanical help, but not hauling. Cody pulls alongside, and Wyatt unloads on the go, a golden waterfall of wheat pouring through the rain into the truck bed. 9:15 a.m. The final pass. The wind is a continuous gale, laying the remaining wheat almost flat against the earth. Wyatt drops the header, low the sickle bar, scraping the mud, scooping up the flattened crop in a final act of defiance. As the last stalk fed into the feeder house, the engine of the Titan II let out a massive, exhausted backfire. Steam billowed from the radiator grill. The fuel gauge was buried on empty, but the north quarter was cut. Every single acre. Wyatt killed the engine and slumped over the steering wheel, the deafening silence of the cab broken only by the heavy drumming of rain on the roof. He had done it. The neon sign of the Sunrise Cooperative Elevator buzzed angrily in the grey morning light. Bill Dawson, the elevator manager, handed Wyatt the final scale ticket through the heavy glass window. "Moisture is at 13.9%, Wyatt," Bill said, shaking his head in disbelief. 1/10% higher, and I would have rejected the load for rot. I don't know how you got it out of the field in this slop, but you made it. Wyatt folded the ticket, his hands trembling with exhaustion, and climbed into Cody's truck. They drove back to the farmhouse, in silence, the weight of the last 4 days pressing down on Wyatt's chest like an anvil. When he pushed through the back door of the farmhouse, the scene was exactly as he had left it. Arthur sat at the head of the oak table. Thomas Gable sat opposite him, the leather briefcase resting on his lap. Wyatt didn't say a word. He walked to the table, pulled the crumpled, grease-stained scale tickets from his pocket, and dropped them onto the wood. 320 acres, Wyatt said, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual fire. Harvested. Delivered. The Titan II is parked by the front gate. It needs a new pulley, but it runs. Thomas Gable picked up the tickets, inspecting the timestamps and the weights. He looked at Arthur and gave a slow, solemn nod. Arthur's face remained a mask of weathered stone, but something in his pale blue eyes softened. The rigid posture that had defined him for decades seemed to sag slightly. He reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the sealed manila envelope across the table. "Open it," Arthur commanded quietly. Wyatt took a seat. His grease-stained fingers struggled with the heavy packing tape, eventually tearing the flap open. Inside was a single handwritten letter on yellow legal paper, and a secondary official-looking document with a state seal. He unfolded the yellow paper. Wyatt, if you are reading this, you fixed the machine. You bled for the dirt. You proved you are a Henderson. I never hated your generation's technology, son. I hated what it represented. I hated the debt, because debt is what killed your father. 5 years ago, Dale didn't just die of a random heart attack. He owed Pinnacle Ag Group $400,000 on a handshake equipment lease that went bad when the market crashed. They cornered him. They sent their corporate sharks to the farm that night, in the freezing rain, threatening to take this house, the land, everything. The stress broke his heart. Literally, I paid off his debt to save the farm, but Pinnacle kept a predatory option on the North Quarter's title. If I passed away, and you inherited the land through normal probate, their lawyers would have activated that clause and seized the dirt before the dirt even settled on my grave. Wyatt stopped reading. The air in the room felt impossibly thin. He looked at the official document tucked behind the letter. It was a recorded wager contract vetted by a state judge. Thomas found a loophole. Arthur's raspy voice broke the silence. A legal wager for property enacted before my death supersedes their secondary lien. But it had to be a legitimate recorded test of skill and labor. It couldn't just be a gift, or Pinnacle would contest it in court. Wyatt stared at his grandfather. You made me use the Titan too. Because I knew that cast iron hub would break, Arthur finished. I was there the night your father rigged it in '98. I knew the only way you could finish the harvest was if you dug through his old tools, found his old iron, and fixed it the way he did. I needed you to understand what survival looks like. It isn't a GPS screen, Wyatt. It's blood iron and an absolute refusal to quit. Arthur leaned heavily on the table, a violent coughing fit suddenly seizing his chest. He pulled a bloody handkerchief from his pocket, wiping his mouth before looking back up at his grandson. The coldness was entirely gone from the old man's face, replaced by a profound, agonizing weariness. I have stage 4 lung cancer, Wyatt. Arthur whispered, the confession hanging heavy in the kitchen air. I have maybe 2 months left. Pinnacle Ag Group offered $3.2 million because they know I'm dying. They thought I would take the cash for medical bills. But this dirt holds your father, and now it legally belongs to you. Tears streamed down Wyatt's dirt-caked face, carving clean tracks through the grease and dust. He looked down at his bruised, bleeding hands, then over at the window where the rusted green frame of the 1982 John Deere sat proudly in the pouring rain. He didn't need the modern fleet. He didn't need the corporate loans. He had everything he needed right here. Wyatt stood up, walked around the oak table, and wrapped his arms around his grandfather's frail shoulders. For the first time in his life, Arthur Henderson hugged him back, holding on as tightly as a broken man could. I won't sell a single acre, Grandpa, Wyatt promised, his voice cracking. Not to Pinnacle, not to anyone. Arthur smiled, closing his eyes as the rain continued to wash over the Kearney County dirt. I know, son. I know. If Wyatt's story of grit family legacy and outsmarting corporate greed inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to honor the hard-working farmers who keep our world running. Share this video with friends who love a real-life underdog story, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible heart-pounding tales from America's heartland. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken Arthur's impossible bet? See you in the next video.